before I talk about my book, I should tell about actually the two times I actually was in the presence of Richard Nixon. The first was in 1960 when I was 4 years old. I was growing up in Chicago, and my parents were Republicans. You can imagine they felt pretty lonely in Chicago, especially in that year, 1960. And I don't remember it, but my mother has always told me, and I've checked it out, it's actually true. I was taken to a Richard Nixon motorcade on one of the expressways outside of Chicago that fall. And that was the time, of course, he was running against John Kennedy. And I was 4 years old, and I was held up in the air as his Cadillac rolled by. And that's how I got my start in presidential history. A future president. And my mother couldn't tell me this, but I did a little research later on, and it turns out the reason I was there was that was the fall that some of you remember, and probably most of you know, the future President Nixon was saying, elect me and your children will not grow up under communism. And the local Republican leaders wanted little kids held up in the air as examples of the non-communists of the future when Nixon was elected. So I was one of those. And, he was elected 8 years later, and I did not become a communist, so that was well met and well kept. So that was the first time. And the second time was in 1992. 32 years later, I was writing a book with Strobe Talbot on the end of the Cold War, and former President Nixon was kind enough to invite the two of us up to lunch at his house in New Jersey, not the house in Saddle River, but the final house that he and Mrs. Nixon lived in, northern New Jersey. This was February of '92, the cold of winter. As I remember that house, some of you probably know about this, maybe if you were even there, it was in a development called Bear's Nest. And the staff was sort of sensitive because Nixon sometimes called the place Eagle's Nest, and they were worried people would deprecate for that. It's ridiculous. So we got there, and the way he did this, I heard from other people who would go to lunch with President Nixon, was, he would do this in a somewhat ceremonial way. He'd spend about an hour in the library at the top of the house, and I think that library is recreated here, isn't it?
Yeah, the study.
Yeah, you see the study. That's the one I'm talking about, with the animals on the upholstery. Very sort of French provincial desk. And, you had very much of the sense that this is where he wrote those books and thought a very great deal. So we went up in the elevator the first hour, and one of the problems with being a presidential historian is if you're in the presence of a real president, obviously, Tim and I know a million times more about these people than they know about us, or I'll speak for myself, they probably know more about Tim. But the thing is that when you're around them, you have to sort of stifle yourself so that you don't sort of spill out everything that you know. And I'm usually pretty good, but in this case, I saw him when I was 4, and he presided over so much of my childhood and youth, I sort of forgot my usual rules because he took us off the elevator. The first thing I saw was, I don't know if this is in the recreation here in the library, but there was a set of golf clubs leaning against the wall. And I said, Mr. President, I thought you would given up golf. And he said, well, yes, ever since I had a hole-in-one. And of course, I had to rudely interrupt by saying, yes, wasn't that in 1961 they put the active ran outside? Which was correct, but he gave me the weirdest look I said to myself, just shut up. So I did. I was on pretty good behavior for the first hour. And then we went down for lunch in this very nice dining room, I remember, with a gas fire, very nice lunch. And I thought this might be the time to tell him what I hope he would find, this nice story about my having seen him in Cook County when I was 4 years old when he was running against Kennedy. And so I said, Mr. President, you may not remember me, but we had met before. So I told him the story. And he fell sort of silent and almost immediately changed the subject to something like, well, what do you think of Boris Yeltsin? And for the rest of the lunch did not refer to what I had said about seeing him when I was a kid. And so I went out of the house thinking I had obviously done something extremely rude. And I thought to myself, what have I done? So I called a friend who knew President Nixon pretty well and said, this is what happened. If you can find out what faux pas I made, I'm sorry for it. Please tell me what it was. And he called me back a couple days later. He says, well, probably you struck out 3 times. I said, number one, these days President Nixon is interested really in the present and the future, not the past. So you brought up this, what is for him, past history. And number two, just in case through some bizarre lapse President Nixon felt like talking about past history, probably the past history he would feel like discussing would not be the 1960 campaign. And strike 3, just in case oddly he wanted to talk about history and the 60 campaign, the place he would really like to discuss would not be Cook County, Illinois. So I guess that there's no general rule that can be pulled out of that except for that even for presidential historians it required some modicum of personal diplomacy, and I certainly didn't follow it that day, but had an absolutely fascinating experience, and it was 2 years before he passed, and one of the most interesting and enlightening experiences of my life. One thing about when you're writing the history of the president, I don't know about it, this happened to Tim, for instance, when he wrote about Kennedy and Khrushchev. I hope he did not come to resemble Khrushchev when he was writing that book. But you begin to resemble the people that you're writing about, and it's a very natural thing because I think Tim will agree that you're thinking about someone 24 hours a day, and you begin to sort of think about the way their minds work. And with the presidents I've written about in this book, you know, George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, all that's fine. I also wrote 2 books on Lyndon Johnson, which was a somewhat more mixed experience. And my wife was a little nervous when I was starting this project because she knew that, you know, people do become replicas of the person they're writing about. She heard all sorts of things about LBJ. So I thought before starting this thing, I'd do some due diligence and sort of, you know, show the 2 people who'd be most effective what their lives would be like if I turned into a living replica of Lyndon Johnson. And so first I went to my assistant. These books were based on these tapes that LBJ made in his private conversations, which Tim is extremely familiar with as a scholar. And I went to my assistant and I thought, well, maybe I should play her a tape of LBJ talking to one of his assistants, or maybe more to the point, screaming at one of his assistants. There were about 800 of those to choose from. So I chose one. And my assistant put the headphones on her head and heard this screaming voice, and she took off the headphones and said, you know, maybe, Michael, this is not the best book for you to be writing, at least while I'm working for you. But, as Tim will attest, LBJ also taped conversations with his wife over the telephone without her knowledge, which I would recommend for any marriage. But the result is that you can actually hear him talking to Lady Bird. Talked to her just beautifully. He would say things like, my darling, I long to see you. My wife took one listen to that and said, this is exactly the book you should be writing. I encourage you to talk a lot more the way that he did. But it really is a problem. I mean, I'll mention one more Johnson story before getting onto this one. But Johnson, another story that in Texas they say has the added advantage of being true. He was asking one of his aides to write a speech for him. The aide brought in the speech text. It was very long. And he looked at it and said, well, text is fine, looks very good. But this opening quotation, as Aristotle said, blah, blah, blah. Johnson said, there's a problem. And he said, what's the problem? Well, as Johnson said, well, nobody in the audience is going to know who the hell Aristotle was. So just keep the quotation, but change it to, as my daddy said. As president, and politically, my guess is, I don't need to ask Tim to tell you that for him and me, this would not do wonders for us as historians and historians practices. So that's what you have to do with this line of work. What this book is about, it's about 9, I should be really a good author and hold up the book, I'm not going to tell the price. 9 presidents, George Washington to Ronald Reagan, 200 years. And what I wanted to do was write the stories of these 9 presidents and choose moments in these presidencies where these presidents essentially looked into the abyss when there was an urgent national need or a crisis where they had to make a choice, and the choice was to do the right thing, even though it may have meant that they would lose their popularity or their re-election or their career or even in their life, as was the case with Abraham Lincoln. And the book opens in 1795, and the scene I've got is George Washington is at Mount Vernon. Probably a few people here have actually visited Mount Vernon. A lot of school field trips and family trips. And you'll agree it's very well restored. It's just the way it did in 1795. And one night that August, Washington was there. This is the scene I've got. And he was writing and was reading letters. And he was angry and he was anxious and he was tormented. And outside it was raining. And the peace weather vane on top of the house was spinning around. And the reason he was so tormented was, for the first time in his life, huge numbers of Americans were furious at him, had contempt for him. They were writing angry letters saying you should be impeached, you should be assassinated. You know, we thought we knew you, we didn't. And the reason this was something that Washington had brought on himself. By his 6th year as president, he had become convinced that the British were possibly going to invade the United States and conquer us and end this country at the age of about 20 because he knew we couldn't resist such an invasion. So to keep that from happening and save the country, he did a treaty with the British, sent John Jay over, who came back with a treaty endorsed, called Jay's Treaty, that said the British would not invade, but it had things in it that many Americans found humiliating. They said, why do we have to go crawling toward the British, whom we just defeated, only a couple decades ago? And they blamed Washington, they blamed Jay. Jay said that he could walk the entire length of the United States at night purely by the light of his burning effigies. And in one of the newspapers, there was a cartoon against Jay in Washington that showed Jay crawling to the British king, and I can't remember the words exactly, but it says something like, in lavish fashion, I surpass your majesty with my lavish kissing of your blank. Newspaper that rhymed with surpass. And the thing was that this was the ordeal of Washington's life. He was used to going into a room and having the children's faces light up and people saying, there's the hero who unites all of our hearts. He had been elected president twice unanimously. All that was gone. He was heartbroken when he left the presidency, and his wife Martha thought that this ordeal hastened his premature death. So why did he do it? He could have very well said, I've got a year and a half left in office, let my successor do it. He did it because he thought only with his prestige could he get Americans to accept this treaty, even though they were angry to save the country. And something even more profound, and that was that when Washington was president, he knew that everything he did was going to set a tradition for later presidents. And so he wanted to send a message to his successors, you're going to have to do as I did. I gave up my popularity. I went through hell to do something important for the country. He invented what I refer to as presidential courage. Said to his predecessors, you're not expected just to be popular. You may have to do something in a crisis at a certain moment that may do it all up. That's what a great leader is. The second president I write about is John Adams. I'll just skip through a few of these to keep the time. Adams was the leader of the party, the Federalists, that was desperate to go to war with France. And for a while, he was too, and he really got into it because secretly Adams was sort of jealous of George Washington's military reputation. And he began, when he gave a speech like this, he would wear a military uniform with this big silver sword gleaming at his side, and he really got into it. So this is, in a way, sort of pleasant, and I'm overcoming this indifference that many people have had toward me. And it was almost as if he was on a bender. And then at a certain moment, it was sort of a moment of stunning realization, almost as if he had woken up after a long night with a splitting headache saying, what have I done? France is attacking our ships on the Atlantic, but they're not an imminent threat. And he went to the leaders of his party and said, we're not going to war. He said, great is the guilt of an unnecessary war. We can't go to war unless there's an immediate threat. They were furious at him. They said, if you make peace with France, we're not going to support you, which they didn't. The result was that Adams lost re-election, had to go back to Massachusetts a loser, nowhere near the year of George Washington. But the key is, what he said to himself was, I hate to lose, it's painful, I wanted 2 terms as president, just like my predecessor, the great General Washington, but, I did it for a good cause, it was necessary to avert this war, and I can go back and I've got other things in my life. I got my wife Abigail, and my children, and my wonderful farm in Massachusetts, and my books, my old friends from the Revolution. And he lived 26 more years, not happily, but it was enough for him. There were other things in his life.